welcome to the second workshop, Creating Learning Outcomes. This short presentation will help you to understand the alignment principle of course design, differentiate the student learning outcome terms and concepts, identify the types of learning outcomes using Bloom's revised taxonomy, and recognize well-formulated learning outcomes. Learning outcomes. Why are they important? Well, effective course design starts with the formulation of learning outcomes, and learning outcomes drive the alignment principle. The alignment principle is that concept of course design wherein all the various elements work together. And of course, the center are the course-intended learning outcomes. Alignment means that the teaching content, instructional tools, the required text, the teaching and learning in class and co-curricular activities, as well as the assessment forms, are all aligned and oriented towards the learning outcome. There are two principles at work in a well-formulated course. The first involves setting your learning outcomes as the orienting principle for all the other elements. And the second involves aligning those elements with each other and the learning outcomes. Let's look more carefully at the terminology. Occasionally you will hear the term learning goals. These are more general than learning outcomes. They often appear in the course catalog, and they refer to the core understandings of the course. Learning objectives are clear statements describing intended skills, knowledge, attitudes, or performance that the course will cover. They are, however, more often than not, written from an instructor perspective, whereas learning outcomes are the achieved results or consequences of what has been learned and focus on the student rather than the instruction. Why learning rather than teaching? Well, simply because the focus ought to be on student learning in terms of course design. Let's look more precisely at learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are statements of what a learner is expected to know, understand, and be able to demonstrate after completion of a learning process. They are performances of understanding. There are several important characteristics of good learning outcomes. First of all, they are appropriate to the course level. They clearly express what you want your students to learn, and the learning outcomes must be understandable to the students. They are measurable of something important, something worth knowing. They are attainable, not aspirational, and they are weighed according to their importance, the time spent on each, or the central importance of them. In 1956, educational theorist Benjamin Bloom published an important model that demonstrated the various levels of learning. And although this model has been revised slightly within the 21st century, it's widely used today as a way of understanding the various levels of student activity. In this diagram, you can clearly see the 6 levels, starting with the lowest, remembering, and moving to the most advanced, creating. These low-level student learning outcomes are, of course, appropriate for introductory classes. Higher-level student learning outcomes are necessary and required for more advanced classes, and an appropriately balanced class will have a mixture of both, depending on the class level. Now, this diagram has the Bloom's taxonomy, the unrevised Bloom's taxonomy. You'll notice the difference here, presented as steps, with the lower learning outcomes, remembering and understanding here, and the higher ones, creating and evaluation here. What's useful about this in formulating student learning outcomes is the list of verbs that appears under each. Student learning outcomes need to use clear, precise, accessible action verbs, which allow for the formulation of meaningful and valid assessments as well as in-class activities. And this chart presents the various action words that can be used from the low level to the high level. So how to write good learning outcomes? Well, as alluded to earlier, a statement of learning outcome contains a verb, an action, and an object. The verb generally refers to a cognitive process, and the object generally refers to the knowledge the students are expected to acquire. For example, at the end of this course, students will be able to predict the appearance and motion of visible celestial objects, formulate scientific questions, plan ways to model and or simulate an answer to the questions chosen. Note the use of the action verbs which were previously described. This chart presents clear and unclear outcomes. The first example, this course will introduce you to the major periods in the history of Western music. The clear outcome clearly identifies or contains what it is the student will be able to do. The outcome is phrased in very precise terms. By the end of the course, you will be able to identify and summarize the important features of major periods in the history of Western music. The second example again, understand is a rather unclear term. Describe the process of photosynthesis makes this much more precise, what's expected of the student. In this example, a term paper, write a term paper, whereas this has what it constitutes an appropriate term paper. Another example of a vague, poorly written student learning outcome, once again using the term understand. And more precise outcomes, the student will be able to describe or evaluate, formulate research questions, design to test, or refine and build theories. All these action verbs make it more clear what the assessment activity ought to be and what the in-class activities ought to be. And in this way, using precise, well-formulated student learning outcomes, one is able to align all the elements of the course. Assignment. Review and refine, if necessary, the learning outcomes of one of the courses that you're going to teach next term. This concludes our third workshop on formulating student learning outcomes. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact the Center for Teaching and Learning. The following workshop will concern the formulation of student learning activities.